Hello everyone! This video essay will be an in-depth exploration of the Legend of Zelda, the Ocarina of Time. It will also be the final game covered in this retro analysis series, and as always, because this video assumes prior knowledge and experience, I'll urge you to play the game before watching if you haven't already. In this series, we've been going over selected games of old to find out what lessons, if any, they have to offer game design. And that will be our goal with this game as well. In case you're new to the channel or this series, I've left links to the previous analyses in the description box below. I'm AesirAesthetics, and this is Ocarina of Time. The Legend of Zelda series is one of the most beloved video game franchises of all time, and is one that has received its fair share of accolades. Like its sister series, Super Mario, it has served as a creative force ever since its inception and has been instrumental in vindicating its fair share of technological and game design innovations. Ocarina of Time launched in 1998 on the N64 and set the industry on fire. The last major console installment was A Link to the Past, which launched a good 7 years earlier. And with the exception of the Game Boy exclusive Link's Awakening, there wasn't much new in the way of rewarding Zelda experience. Whenever a console generation has included a Zelda title, that generation tends to be characterized by that title, at least to some extent, and expectations were high for Ocarina of Time to do just this. And as if that wasn't stressful enough for the developers, corporate expectations were also through the roof. The N64 was considered to be one of the industry's loser consoles. Since the arrival of the PlayStation, Nintendo had lost a lot of the market to Sony, whose wider developer outreach and greater CD storage system made them a force to be reckoned with. Nintendo executives weren't very happy with the performance of their console, so they pinned their hopes on Ocarina of Time being a successful title. And to that end, they went all out. This game had a larger staff than any previous Nintendo game, it had a grander vision than any previous Nintendo game, and it was being helmed by the legendary director Shigeru Miyamoto. The last game Miyamoto had directed was Super Mario 64, and when the development of this game began, he assigned the directorial duties to several directors. His plan was to have them work on separate elements which could be brought together during the final stages of development. This didn't pan out as expected. Technical problems kept popping up, messing up the entire schedule. The 3D technology was still not fully understood by any game designer, and even though much of this team had been instrumental in creating Star Fox and Super Mario 64, they still had their work cut out for them. Eventually, the technical and scheduling problems prompted Miyamoto to step in as lead director to whip this project into shape. Miyamoto is an interesting character, and how he approaches game design has always been interesting to observe. Early on in this game's development, he assigned to the team members a fun task. They were all instructed to write down some ideas on things they wanted to do with a three-dimensional game. These ideas were then posted on a wall to face the scrutiny of the other team members. The entire team went through each idea and searched for those they thought would best capture the spirit of the Zelda series, with a specific interest being placed on any idea that seemed impossible to execute, since those ideas would not have been done by anyone else at that point in time. Two ideas that were crucial to the lead team members were Sword Combat and Epona. The directors all agreed that without these two ideas, the game wouldn't work. Early in development, the game was supposed to be played in the first person except during battles, which would be when the player controlled a three-dimensional Link. This weird idea can be attributed to Miyamoto. His thinking was that the first-person perspective would get the player more invested in their immediate environment, and that it would allow things like dungeons and enemies to truly shine. Back then, the idea of a camera occupying a game world was still fresh, and much of Ocarina of Time was designed specifically to play differently from Super Mario 64. Those two factors led to the camera in this game being focused on the world and not the main character. But the first-person on-rail system was eventually changed, and much of that has to do with how the team's perception of a 3D Zelda game evolved. It's weird to think about this game in terms of what might have been, but for the sake of fairness, a three-dimensional game was still something of an abstract concept during those days. The shift from a first-person rail game to a third-person free-roam game comes about because of different reasons, depending on which developer you'd ask, but two significant factors were the same two that the team were so adamant about getting right: sword fighting and Epona. Cracking the C targeting system was a big milestone in this game's development. By implementing it, the enemy engagements could effectively be locked to make more focused usage out of the X and Y axes. The C-axis, or up and down, had proven itself somewhat underwhelming combat-wise in the team's last game, but in this game it's used where it serves the most purpose, in ranged attacks and the like. The reason sword fighting was such a big focus in this game was that the developers had wanted to make a sword fighting focused Zelda game ever since they released Zelda 2. Miyamoto has admitted that this is one of his regret titles, in that he regrets not exploring the combat's full potential at the time. The decision to move away from rails can be attributed to Epona. She was originally a carryover idea brought to Zelda from Super Mario 64, and according to Miyamoto, she was the seminal piece that made the game what it is. She killed the idea for a Super Mario 64 style hub system. She killed the on-rail sequences split up by moments of combat. Epona was a big game changer, which is funny in retrospect, because in spite of inhabiting much of the iconic imagery the game is known for, she's not that important to the game itself. When Ocarina of Time launched, its amazing legacy was established instantly. This game has more best game of all time acknowledgements than any other, and even though it's a landmark title, this is not how we're going to proceed. I try to remove my personal bias from these videos because it's unfair to critique a game on any merit other than what it itself set out to accomplish. And any best game of all time criticism is inherently unfounded because it's not what this game set out to accomplish. When Ocarina of Time was being created, the developers had specific goals in mind. They wanted it to be a game unlike any other. They wanted it to be such a unique experience that it wouldn't even be comparable to any other. They wanted to capture the spirit of the Zelda series and revitalize it for the three-dimensional future. They wanted to tell a story about time, and they wanted to blow the player away. I'm confident that this video will address accurately the game's central aspirations. And with that said, let's go over the game's story. Ocarina of Time's story is that of a young boy embarking on an adventure, turning into a hero and saving the world. This classic story is as old as time itself, and what better way to frame this discussion than with the hero's journey? The hero's journey, or monomyth, is the go-to structure for tales of heroism and originates from Joseph Campbell's 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In essence, Campbell, who was an avid student of narrative, was working on the writings of Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung and suggested that there's something within each man that drives him to want to tell the story of the hero. His hypothesis is supported by his study into mythologies and cultures. Campbell notes that no matter how distant cultures were from one another, whether geographically or in time, their legends of myth, history, and religion can all be boiled down to what are essentially the same 17 steps, through which an ordinary person is transformed into something extraordinary. This writing is one of the most interesting of the entire 20th century, if not for its significant findings, then for its significant influence. This story outline has been used hundreds of times and serves as the backdrop to a significant portion of pop culture's most beloved works. Now, as impressive as all of that is, it's important to note the major criticism of Campbell's writings before pressing onwards. Campbell states that the monomyth is more symbolic than literal and serves as a sort of macro story, with the finer details being left in the hands of the specific storyteller, which is often seen to be a huge cop-out on his behalf. This philosophy of his would have given him creative license to extend his interpretations of the myths he studied until they could be contained within the monomyth's framework. And if he couldn't do that, Campbell would be quick to say that a lack of a specific step can be as important as the step itself. Whether or not you buy into the collective unconscious and whatever you think of the monomyth, there's no denying its value. Whatever lies behind it, it's a very effective way to structure a narrative of this kind, and although, to my knowledge, there's no direct statement from any major Ocarina of Time developer that the monomyth served as an influence on the game, I decided it was still worth including in the discussion because Ocarina of Time follows the hero's journey story structure down to the finest details, and even if that's not enough to vindicate the monomyth as an influence, whether conscious or unconscious, it still makes the monomyth a very effective way to frame all upcoming story discussions. The monomyth is, in essence, the story of transformation, wherein a person comes to be, then through trial and tribulations becomes a hero, obtains power, defeats the bad guy, and then returns to their own world. The task Campbell assigns to all would-be heroes is to unite opposing concepts, good and evil, chaos and order, age and youth. And with that said, let's take a look at Ocarina's opening. The story begins with the Great Deku Tree giving an opening monologue and then cuts to show Link's nightmare. The Great Deku Tree's purpose in the story will be to herald the beginning of Link's adventure. He sends Navi to wake Link up, referring to him only as the boy without a fairy, and the remainder of this opening is a rather well-executed tutorial. Link is introduced to the player as a kid, so there's an instant rapport with him. Child protagonists have an advantage in that everyone can relate to being a kid. Navi remarks that Link is lazy, and him waking up is a very relatable feeling, which goes some way towards establishing an early bond between Link and the player. Next, the player leaves the treehouse, and after they've talked to Saria, they head towards the Great Deku Tree. Except, no. Because before Link is allowed to meet the Great Deku Tree, it is demanded that he acquire a sword and a shield. Acquiring these items demands that the player undertakes a bit of exploration. The sword is hidden behind this thinly veiled camera tutorial, and the shield is purchased from this very sickly looking child. While the player scrounges the Kokiri forest for some rupees to buy the shield, they'll be able to talk to the Kokiri children strewn around the map. They offer the player pointers, act as optional tutorials, and set up the early game's carefree and whimsical tone. After talking to the Great Deku Tree and learning that Ganondorf has cursed it, Link can agree to enter it, and this will be the tutorial dungeon, wherein the player will become familiar with most of the game's utilities of the camera, and will learn the fundamentals of navigating 3D space. They must walk up a ladder, traverse a spiraling pathway, must climb vines, shoot projectiles, and then have the spatial reasoning to jump down to break some cobweb. Afterwards, they travel in a loop, and thereafter they engage the tutorial boss. To start the fight, the player must prove their grasp of the camera controls and look up at her. The fight itself is good enough, and it tests the player's mastery of the game's fundamentals. The Great Deku Tree dungeon has effectively set up everything the player will need to know about the early game gameplay, and has more or less primed them for every utility of the 3D camera. I'd say it's an objectively perfect dungeon in that it knocks every one of its design goals out of the park. After leaving it, Link witnesses as the Great Deku Tree dies. Having accepted the quest it assigned him, Link then leaves the Kokiri forest. Before he's out, he meets Saria again, who gives him her fairy ocarina. Then, the player is subjected to the absolutely slowest text scroll in video game history. An apologist might say that This was included to test the player on their virtue of patience, but it was probably designed this way under the assumption that the player was going to be an 8-year-old who would need all the help they could get. I suppose that can be seen as wholesome game design, but there's undeniably an undertone of nastiness in how the owl asks the player if they want to go through this text scroll all over again. Upon leaving the Kokiri Forest, the player finds themselves in Hyrule Field. For this moment in the game, Miyamoto was adamant that the primary thing the player should feel was awe. Awe of the, at the time, huge and open landscape. That feeling in this moment, in conjunction with the energetic musical score, signifies that the game's adventure has officially begun. The Hyrule Field present in the game includes many early examples of what would later become standard video game affair. Things like the day and night cycle, which is presented with a change in lighting, textures, and by a change in fog density. But the Hyrule Field present is actually the result of severe content downsizing. Originally, Hyrule Field had more obstacles like harsher terrain and challenging weather. It also had a different atmosphere than what's currently present. These ideas were scrapped both to fit the game within the technical constraints of the N64 and because they made riding Epona into an unsatisfying activity. As I mentioned earlier, Epona was a big game changer and Hyrule Field was where she arguably made her biggest impact. Early in development, when it wasn't clear what kind of game this was going to be, Miyamoto foresaw the possibility of having the entire game take place within Ganon's castle, and then later on, there were ideas floating around about a castle hub system like in Super Mario 64. Ocarina's game engine is a heavily modified version of the Super Mario 64 engine, so going down this path would make some sense, but when Epona caught the developers' interests, the hub was moved from Hyrule Castle to Hyrule Field, and the map was made to appear as if it was a seamless world instead of one connected with warps. I say appear because the game is really a collection of small boxy rooms loosely connected together and then dressed up as an expansive world. Hyrule Field branches off into several directions and each path leads to a somewhat linear story segment. There are places where the areas are cheated into intersecting, which goes some way in bringing the seamlessly connected world aspect to the forefront. And there's even a great moment in the story wherein Link must learn to play the music of the forest from Saria to play it for the Goron chief Darunia, who likes to dance to it, and must have been exposed to it through the blocked tunnel leading from Goron City to the Lost Woods. What can be accomplished in an open world game today is often taken for granted, but looking at a setup like this puts things into perspective. Nintendo actually went out of their way to link the world together and were so proud of the result that they decided to point it out in the story. This realization is enough to make one appreciate the effort on display a bit more. Putting the score and visuals aside for now, the arrival in Hyrule Field also gets its punch by breaking the conditioning. The game's opening has the players spend their time navigating small boxy rooms, which gave them a frame of reference to juxtapose this reveal against. Something really admirable about this game world is its internal variety. In the opening hours, Link travels from a forest to a castle, then up a mountain and finally inside the belly of a gigantic fish. In these areas, Link is introduced to the 8 primary races inhabiting the world. There's the Kokiri, the Fairies, the Hylians, the Deku, the Sheikah, the Gorons, the Gerudo, and the Sora. Most of these races are gradually expanded upon throughout the game, and they all have their distinct culture which the player gets to explore to varying degrees. Of the main races, the Kokiri are somewhat carefree children, the Hylians are energetic people, the Gorons are friendly mountain dwellers, the Sora are fairly isolationist, and the Gerudo are somewhat barbaric. What these essentially are hobbits, humans, dwarves, elves and Amazonians and goblins. We're interacting with the base races of the traditional fantasy universe after they've been given their interesting twist. The world in Ocarina of Time is chock full of traditional fable and fantasy tropes being played on and subverted. A few examples include the magic beans, Peter Pan, and the sword in the stone. Western culture through a Japanese filter is usually a winning combination, and it achieves a great result in this game. When Link opened the Sacred Realm, he unwittingly paved the way for Ganondorf to conquer the world. Something I touched on in my Final Fantasy VII video was that great fantasy universes tend to include an item or phenomena which enable the storyteller to delve into characters in interesting ways. Ocarina's item of choice is the Ocarina of Time itself, and the most effective way it's used to delve into the characters is to have it be the key item Link needed to access the time travel. Miyamoto envisioned Ocarina of Time as a game that sees a young boy grow to become an accomplished adult. The idea was that, when contrasting their experience as a child with their experience as an adult, the player could return to areas that once challenged them and overcome with ease. But this could actually put the player in the mindset of even greater accomplishment because they are more overtly aware of the differences in what they're experiencing. The feeling of satisfaction and growth would be the player's reward for enduring the road to adulthood and the trials that had lain in their journey. After the time travel, the world changes immensely. The once upbeat characters are now visibly downtrodden, and much of the humanity of the game has been snuffed out, so every location feels emptier. The game uses this juxtaposition to make the upbeat early moments that much lighter and the downtrodden later moments that much darker. The game uses the time travel to unite these opposing concepts, and no example highlights the tonal differences better than the dungeon layout in the early game and in the late game. Late game dungeons like the Bottom of the Well, the Shadow Temple, and the Spirit Temple isolate Link, whereas earlier dungeons like the Great Deku Tree and the Fire Temple had him surrounded by friendlies. The latter dungeons are more distant in both a physical and spiritual sense than the earlier ones, and they don't see Link utilize his most valuable and admirable trait as much. The dungeons in the early games showcase that Link is able to make friends out of a surprising amount of characters he comes across. This skill of his is still present in the late game, but it's not as often as central to the dungeons. Rather, Link travels the entirety of Hyrule, and with a couple of exceptions, the goals he strives towards are usually to support some friends he's made during his travels. The developers' goals when they were designing the characters was to make them feel real to the player. Much of that feeling was achieved by the animators, who strived to give each character separate animations to convey to the player their uniqueness. That made the characters individually distinct, but the realism comes across through the characters all having activities throughout the day and from how the characters change to fit their surrounding both pre and post timeskip. Link was out of action for 7 years and the world didn't really wait for him. The characters went on living, and the changes in their demeanor is another example of how the game uses contrast for storytelling. There's something interesting about Nintendo characters which hasn't been noted very often, and that is that Nintendo likes to hide away tutorials or abstract mechanics by presenting them as characters. And a prime example of this would be Navi. Navi, named for her purpose as a navigator, can be thought of as the most engaging quest arrow in game design history. She gets a lot of crap for being annoying, but that's a strong case for the success of her implementation. No one thinks of her as an annoying quest arrow, people think of her as an annoying character. Another example of this is the Golden Skulltula Collectathon. It would have been easy to just give the player a checklist of hidden collectibles, but Nintendo went the extra mile and masked the collectathon as Link helping to break a curse. This also makes it a character-driven activity. And even though Nintendo aren't actually the only ones to design their games like this, it's worth pointing out simply for the sheer amount of times they've done this and been successful. An extremely liberal reading of the word character will tell you that Ocarina of Time has around 100 of them. If we discount the chickens and characters only referred to and never seen, that number drops closer to 60. The minor characters could be created 2 to 3 per week, and they caused a lot of problems in development. So many characters had to be timed to not interfere with anyone else's activities, and they all needed to feel like they belonged in the same game world. Major characters also brought with them a host of problems, which is probably why there aren't very many of them. The final thing of note about how the characters manage to feel real is that their stories aren't dumped on the player. The player needs to actively search them out. If they want to know what a specific character is all about, they might need to trail them as they go about their lives, or use the time travel to explore and see what happens to them. The entire game is to some extent exploration driven. Whenever a problem pops up, just explore. If there's anything the player is having a hard time remembering in the opening, they can talk to the kids in the Kokiri Forest until they get a better grasp of their abilities. If there's ever a boss battle that's too difficult, the solution is to explore the world and return with more hit points or some health regenerating fairies. If there's ever a moment that the game becomes a drag to play, there'll be something interesting in going off the beaten path. Ocarina of Time's exploration is threefold. First, there's the exploration of the world as a physical object. Then there's the exploration of the characters in the world. Finally, there's the exploration of changes through time. Something I like about the game is how much of it can go unutilized by the casual or even by the overly skilled player. Things like the frogs near the Zora's domain, the goddess magics, and the fairy fountains. There's actually a real case to be made that playing this game to win is suboptimal. The real meat of the experience comes in wandering the world and seeing what it has to offer, to grow and develop within it instead of just rushing through it. There's a real satisfaction in hearing characters talk about a secret fairy fountain and reaching it, or hearing that you can turn butterflies into fairies and doing it. It's rewarding to prepare for the game's challenges by understanding the game on its own terms and being successful in implementing your strategies. And much of the exploration is also aided by what I said earlier about mechanics hiding as characters. The scarecrows being a prime example of this. They allow Link to grapple them in order to reach places he might not otherwise, to obtain secret collectibles. But to access their utility, the player must play a song for them in the past and then replay that song again in the future from memory. The game being exploration driven also brought something to it which Nintendo loves: playground discussions, binding human interaction outside of the game to the game. This adds an element of social experience that helps ingrain the game in the mind. The often quizzical nature of the game world is great fuel for speculation, and speculations create theories and communities, which encourage replays, purchases, and again, help ingrain the game in the mind. The theme of exploration is also hammered into every questline the game has to offer, and there are examples of quests designed to take advantage of every one of the 3 types of exploration in the game. Exploring changes in time can be seen with a magic bean dealer. He sells magic beans which young Link can plant in specific areas in the past. If the player then returns to these areas in the future, they'll have a platform which usually leads them to a heart piece. The best exploration of the world quest is in acquiring the Begoron sword. This sees Link help a giant Goron blacksmith regain his eyesight by having the player travel from Death Mountain to Kakariko Village, then from there to the Lost Woods, back to Kakariko Village, and then from there back to the Lost Woods, and then to Gerudo Valley, which leads the player to the Zora's Domain, to Lake Hylia, and finally back to Death Mountain. This quest has several instances of Link racing across the map on a fixed timer and demands that the player knows the location of various characters in the game. It rewards the player with the Begoron sword, which is the most powerful weapon in the game. Finally, the best exploration of the character's quest is, in my opinion, the mask salesman. He rents out masks to Link, which he is then supposed to sell forwards to other characters in the world. This incentivizes the player to engage with more characters and gets the player more involved in the characters' stories. Just like the Begoron sword quest, selling the masks takes Link on a journey across various areas, although this quest isn't at any point on a timer, and unlike the Begoron sword quest, the exploration is more localized to areas near Castletown. Since this quest relied on the player being familiar with the characters, it fittingly rewards them with 4 masks. 3 of them are purely for novelty, but the 4th gives the player the ability to read gossip stones and see what's on the characters' minds and in their hearts. I said earlier that the dungeons get more and more isolating the further the player progresses, and now I'm going to go a bit more in depth on the dungeons in this game. Some of the first dungeons include the Great Deku Tree, which is literally the herald of the adventure, and Jabu Jabu's Belly, wherein Link is partnered with Princess Ruto. But by the end, Link has traveled through torture chambers and disappeared into the desert. Each dungeon is visually distinct, and to some degree they help tell the stories of the sages. I have a very liberal reading of what constitutes a Zelda dungeon, and going over my list quickly, there's the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, Jabu Jabu's Belly, the Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Ice Cavern, Water Temple, Bottom of the Well, Shadow Temple, Gerudo's Fortress, Spirit Temple, and finally Ganon's Castle. Child Link was implemented in the game after some development time, so it's safe to assume that his dungeons weren't necessarily the first to be developed. And there's actually a noticeable shift from the dungeons in the early game and the dungeons in the late game. The first dungeon tackled by Adult Link is the Forest Temple, and it's the first dungeon to include keys. Every dungeon Adult Link goes through, excluding the Ice Cavern, includes them, but the beginning dungeons, which Child Link tackles, don't. As is usually the case in Zelda games, the dungeons give the player an item and then tests their creativity in that item's utility. Most dungeons in Ocarina of Time also include a final boss, which is often defeated with the item found in that dungeon. This is generally how Zelda dungeons seem to be designed, but to throw away each dungeon's nuance to have them fit this framework would be unfair. There's a lot of interesting progress curves in the dungeons, and for the most part, they're designed in very interesting ways. I already mentioned how the Great Deku Tree introduces the player to 3D spatial reasoning by having them go up to go down, and then go deeper and deeper. Dodongo's Cavern showcases the Dodongos as a base enemy in various stages of its life and culminates in the boss fight, which is against King Dodongo. Jabu Jabu's Belly showcases Link traveling from the mouth to go deeper and deeper into the body, almost as if to say, the only way out is in. The Forest Temple is another interesting temple in that it twists the player preconceived notion of 3D spatial reasoning on its head. It also has Link chase 4 distinct enemies before fighting a Phantom Ganondorf boss fight, which might be taking place in a leftover room from back when this game had a warp-style hub. The Fire Temple is an enormous puzzle wherein Link must not only reach the boss room, but must also set free the various Gorons which Ganondorf has imprisoned. The Ice Cavern is the first mini-dungeon, and I think it's fair to say that this is the least impressive dungeon in the game. There's very little of note about it, and it feels like it was only included because the team wanted to have an ice level. There's something appealing about Link returning to the Zora's Domain, only to see that it's been frozen over, but this introduction is let down by a meandering dungeon, which is followed by the infamous Water Temple. The Water Temple is my favorite temple, but only in the 3DS remake. It includes, in my opinion, the most interesting progression, wherein the player must set the water level to one of 3 heights. Each one unlocks new areas, and the entire dungeon is essentially 3 dungeons overlaid on top of each other and made to act as a large puzzle box. The trope of water levels in games is that they suck because they slow down progress, but I admire Nintendo's approach for this dungeon. They tried to use water as a legitimate tool for puzzle solving. It's a real shame that the constant menu switching bogged it down in the original release and made it the most unplayable part of the game, but thankfully, time has healed that wound and largely redeemed it. This dungeon also has my favorite boss fight in the Shadow Link mini-boss. There are overpowered strategies to defeat him, mainly the hammer, but the plain sword fight I think is more interesting. Then, the final boss for this dungeon is a satisfying fight against a pool ball inside of a water tentacle. It's funny how greatly what is generally agreed upon to be the worst Zelda dungeon can be elevated with a minor tweak in the speed with which the player can toggle the iron boots. The bottom of the well is an interesting dungeon as well, in that it penalizes the player for not having the Lens of Truth, then gives them the Lens of Truth, and then, as a way of apologizing, gives the player the option to open several chests with it. It's been theorized by data miners that the bottom of the well originally served as the Hyrule Castletown sewer system, and was the road the player would take to meet Princess Zelda in the courtyard. This theory is supported by how this dungeon is tackled by Child Link, and by how there seems to be some similarities when overlaying the 2 maps. Whether this is true or not, I'm happy with the road present. It's a stealth segment in a game not designed for stealth. A more elegant narrator than myself might say that the optimization of present mechanics to tackle problems outside of their original intent lends depth and satisfaction to the player's application of them, and that by taking this route, the road to the courtyard can demand a complete overhaul of the player's current reading of the game's visual language. But I'd never say that. I just like how Link meets the Mario Easter egg character sleeping near some crates and moat leading to a pipe. And that Link has to make a bridge to reach the pipe, whereas Mario would jump. A wink and a nod from the developers to the player. Anyways, this is the mini-dungeon which sets the stage for the Shadow Temple, and these 2 dungeons argue for a point which I absolutely agree with, which is that kids can handle a bit of horror. If we count the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple as one dungeon, then that dungeon, along with the Spirit Temple, distinguishes itself by the fact that Link must, in order to solve it, enter as both a child and as an adult. The Shadow Temple is arguably the most visually interesting dungeon, and like all dungeons, it has that seminal piece which defines it. The boss fight with Bongo Bongo occurs after the player has traveled deep within the dungeon and used a boat that leads them to him, sort of like the ferryman leading the hero to their fight against Hades in the underworld. Gerudo's Fortress is another showcase of stealth in a game not designed for stealth, but in this section, the player can incapacitate the guards. After befriending the Gerudo, the player can tackle a mini-dungeon within this quasi-dungeon which rewards them with the ice arrows. To reach the Spirit Temple, the player must cross the River of Sand, and upon reaching it, the player will be more distant from their opening home than ever before. The Spirit Temple starts with Child Link solving relatively easy puzzles to aid a Gerudo woman he befriended moments earlier. It then sees him time travel to save her, which is when the friendly atmosphere of the dungeon is replaced with something a bit more spiritual in nature. Link is arguably more alone in this dungeon than at any other point in the game, and is a good example of him fulfilling his duties as a monomyth hero and uniting opposing concepts. First off, the Shadow Temple played on shadows and what could not be seen, and the Spirit Temple plays on mirrors and what is reflected. The two dungeons contrast each other, and the items Link is given do this as well. Reveal what's hidden, reflect what's seen. The boss fight of the Spirit Temple is another showcase of making Link unite opposing concepts. Link defeats the Ice Witch by redirecting the Fire Witch's spells at her, and vice versa. The final dungeons in Ganon's castle are essentially brief vertical slices which tests most of the player's available skills before granting them access to the Ganondorf boss fight. Something the developers did when designing the dungeons was to reduce the enemy count across the board whenever possible. This was done because they favored puzzle solving over killing enemies, because it left a more lasting sense of accomplishment. Another change in development is that the medallions Link obtains after completing the dungeons were originally planned to have utility in combat and puzzle solving. The player was supposed to combine them together to create specific effects. A remnant of this is seen on the floor to the entrance of the Shadow Temple, wherein the player would have used the fire medallion to light the surrounding torches, and another remnant is seen in the different types of arrows Link collects instead of enchanting his bow. This was eventually scrapped as the Ocarina became a more prominent item in the story. Miyamoto has elaborated on this, stating that playing the Ocarina is more rewarding than casting a spell. This philosophy of his actually caused some panic in the final stretches of the game's development when he proclaimed that there weren't enough songs. This might be why summoning Epona is done with the Ocarina instead of blowing a reed as originally planned, and why Link must often play Zelda's lullaby instead of pulling levers or pressing buttons when puzzle solving. All in all, the dungeons are varied and distinct enough that they all mostly make the grade, and their place in the story feels very organic. The first 3 dungeons in the opening see their visual themes re-explored right after the time skip, and the ensuing ones are expertly structured to fit Link's growth as a protagonist. The story follows a basic 3-act structure, and each act showcases the developer's excellent grasp of storytelling. The opening act sees Link's introduction as an adventurous young boy. The second act ratchets up the stakes with him being sent to the future. Then, the third act sees him mastering his obstacles and arriving on top. And if we narrow down our definition of a dungeon, then they showcase this master touch as well. The first 3 are in the innocent past, the next 3 are in the future, and then of the final 3 dungeons, 2 showcase both of these timelines. Something Ocarina of Time does, which not a lot of time travel stories do, is spinning the tragic angle. The time travel in this game is usually not played for laughs, and it certainly isn't a tool which Link uses to make his life awesome. There's some pretty heavy stuff on display considering this game's target audience. There's a sense of eventuality to every action in the game, and it makes it so that saving the world doesn't feel all that heroic. It feels more tragic to see the 6 sages, characters we've gotten to know and seen change, concede to the destiny prepared for them. Then, returning back to his own time after defeating Ganon, Link is the only thing that's changed from the entire experience, and he must carry it with him wherever he goes. The story structure is great. For kids, the time travel shakes up their perception of the game and makes it infinitely more interesting, and for adults, the past scenes effectively set up the future's application of tragic nostalgia. Link will carry this experience with him. If we wanted to get into it, there's a case to be made that Link's journey is only at its second stage during the game's end. The monomyth can be split into a 2-part story, and the game does cover both, but it covers most of the later half in the span of the game's final 15 minutes. Link meets the goddess before fighting Ganondorf, and she bequeaths to him the light arrows. The atonement with the father signifies a hero's ultimate challenge, and for Link's adventure, that challenge is facing the threat that's haunted him since the game began, obtaining his power, and confronting him. That confrontation has 3 examples of the pre-established rules of the game being broken to symbolize the importance of this engagement. The first is that Link doesn't descend to fight him, but rather ascends, which he would usually do to get rewards or make allies. Then, he's unable to lock on to Ganondorf in their fight, which means that a massive crutch is kicked from under the player. Finally, in the Ganon fight, Link is disarmed and must spend the fight on the back foot. After defeating Ganon, the apotheosis occurs. Apotheosis refers to a change in the hero, like a transcendence or achieving a higher plane of existence. For the player, this simply refers to the completion of the adventure, and their change can be something as simple as their idea of what a video game can mean. For Link, his apotheosis is in the characters he's touched. He's become a hero to almost every character in the game and has touched the heart of every culture he's interacted with. His apotheosis is his change from a boy to a hero, and it reaches its climax when he saves the world from Ganon. This is followed by the ultimate boon, which usually refers to an item the hero receives. But since Link doesn't really strive for gold or treasure, his reward is knowing that the world is safe. The refusal of the return is non-existent, unless you count this micro-hesitation he gives when Zelda asks for the Ocarina so she can send him back to his own time. The magic flight is simply the Ocarina being played to send him back, and the rescue from without doesn't occur because Link didn't object to being sent back. Link's crossing of the return threshold is him leaving the Master Sword in the Temple of Time and returning to the world he left behind when he began his adventure. Link is now the hero of time, which signifies his ascendance to mastery of both worlds, past and future. Finally, Link is unshackled from the responsibilities thrust upon him by destiny and made free to live. Most of this is shown in the closing moments of the game, and it kinda undercuts the significance of the story that it's completed so swiftly. I understand that most of these story beats wouldn't play out in a satisfying way, being spread out over dungeons, and the presentation as is far from horrible. But actually, this entire ending can be thought of as simply being the meeting of the goddess, with Zelda filling that role, and her gift to Link can be thought of as being the Ocarina of Time and mastery of time travel, and not the light arrows. If we look at it like this, then Majora's Mask slides in perfectly to complete Link's journey as a hero. Of course, this is where I must again bring up that the mana myth is a very wishy-washy concept. It's a great tool for structure, but for analysis it gives way to much more questions and interpretations than rock-solid answers with everlasting satisfaction. Link is the silent protagonist to beat. He's the most iconic one there is, and he stands shoulders taller than the entire competition. And Ocarina of Time Link can be argued to be the greatest incarnation. He's sympathetic, wrapped in tragedy, brave, justified, and just lovable enough to make the cut. His sympathy arrives from his good nature and his opening introduction as a child. His tragedy comes from him being made to fulfill a quest which will ultimately have no bearing on the world, and then having to end his days by becoming a Stalfos. His bravery comes from his refusal to run away during times of adversity. His justification as a hero is his natural growth. Every item he acquires gives him more command over the world, which is a much more believable setup than, say, an experience bar would be. And finally, Link's lovability comes from the little touches. The biggest thing separating Link from the absolute monomyth hero is that because he's a video game character, he never doubts his purpose or refuses his tasks. And he's made all the more heroic for it. Ocarina of Time's story is the classic hero's journey. It sees Link go from a young boy to a hero who defeats the ultimate evil. The game was designed to be the template for all 3D Zelda games to follow, and it more than nailed that goal. Ocarina of Time is the template which every game now follows. In a way, everything this industry makes today is a response to this game. Much like how the monomyth created the template which hero stories would follow for decades, Ocarina of Time created the template which games would emulate to this day. There's arguably no game as inspirational or as copied as this one. Even if you haven't played it, you have by osmosis. Ocarina of Time was a transitional piece made to capture the old Zelda crowd as well as the new generation of Nintendo players. It's been stated by Miyamoto that the 7-year difference in Kid Link and Adult Link being as long as the year difference between the launches of A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time is purely a coincidence, but come on, what a bad lie. The beginning hours are full of exploration, laughter, wonder, and imagination. People talk to you kindly and the world seems large. Then Link grows up and the same world seems smaller. The people are sad and everyone is afraid. Finding the moments of joy in a setup like this makes one relish them even more. The best lesson this game has to teach is to allow the player to have their fun. Ocarina of Time allows them to explore, experience, and adventure. Whenever a player is given a blank check to write their experience on, they'll take the framework the game provides and turn the experience into something magical. Ocarina of Time is the best example there is of this philosophy. It let the player have their fun, and they in turn made it into the best game of all time. Thanks for watching. The footage used in this video was supplied by World of Longplays as played by Ricky C. If you've been following the Retro Analysis series up until this point, then you might be saddened to hear that barring a special rounding up episode, it's finally reached its logical conclusion. I'm AesirAesthetics, and next time we'll be putting on our space boots and revisiting a world we got a glimpse at last October in the start of a new channel series. Hope to have you aboard.